Complex is a terrifying word for the mainstream audience to hear. In a world in which a simple story like The Mandalorian is often the most successful, offering simple but well-told stories that tick all the boxes for success. Dark is the complete opposite, literally leaving you in the dark on what is happening right up until its final episodes. But I'm not going to pretend that I know everything about Dark's complex interweaving of plot and characters across more than 5 different eras and 3 alternate world. No, I'd like to ask the question of how Dark uses its visuals to convey such complexity in a way that makes it not only a masterpiece to look at, but also supports the show in a way that makes all its other elements elevate to the same masterful degree. As I mentioned earlier, Dark explores time travel,
Time machine is kaputt.
with the first season taking place primarily in 2019, 1986 and 1953. To distinguish these locations, cinematographer Niklaus Samara decided to use the new Arri Alexa camera that was to be the first used on television, with a 65mm lens that would later be used in the movie Joker, and you can see the similarities in the way it softens the faces and has a shallower depth of field. Instead of applying multiple LUTs in post-production, there was instead a focus on the lighting to describe the time period so that the entire look would be settled in camera and not left to the colour grading, of which many hours were spent under studio lighting with his interns to grasp how the lighting affected the picture. The sequences in 2019 took place in the autumn, so the scenes needed to feel colder and overcast, with the indoor environments using the colour scheme of peaches and stone blues, with the light seeping in being softer to create less contrast and more elegance. The problems that come with this use of lighting lie in the audience's expectations. Since the show was developed for Netflix, it was undoubtedly aiming to reach a global audience outside of its native country of Germany, and therefore what may appear as a realistic look for the modern day may look foreign to the wider world. Because of this, the 1986 setting took on more of a stereotypical look of warmer and more saturated colours in order to bring more life to the past, and further emphasise which time periods are safer than others. 1986 mainly being where the discoveries are made in the first season, as we begin to piece together the clues as to everyone's identities in the past, which causes the bolder use of colour to bring some enlightenment to the audience and correspond the lighter colours with learning more information, while the darker colours of 2019 and later on in the timeline will be where the mystery is set up further. If we're talking about having 3 time periods, then it's important to briefly touch upon the rule of 3 that is a huge part of the philosophy of the show. This includes the 3 seasons of the show, the beginning, middle and end, the 3 alt worlds, the 33 years in between each time period, all tying back to the Quai Tretra, the loop that causes the time-travelling cave to open and allow the past, present and future to influence each other. In a writing capacity, this also is what keeps information in your reader's mind. They will remember something if it's told to them 3 times, and this is also reflective in the cinematography. The show's first scene shows Michael hanging himself, and the importance of this inciting incident that sets off the chain of events is reminded to us 2 more times, with Jonas's hanging in both Season 2 and 3, with Season 2's leaving a permanent scarring that carries along a visual parallel to his father throughout the entire remainder of the show. And speaking of Season 2, this season opens with an introduction to a further 2 time periods, being 1921 and 2053. Despite being the furthest back the show had gone up until this point, Samara kept using the Arri Alexa to provide the crispest image possible, but instead utilise natural sunlight much more than artificial lighting, and hand-painted his own lenses that would add further diffusion to the edges of the frame, to resemble a photograph from the 1920s and also bring out the colours, with the red of Jonas's neck and the blue of his eyes being a particular success with the new lens. The use of primary colours is also an example of this rule of 3, since dark rarely strays away from its stone blues and softer colour palette. However, when it does, it becomes more striking and eye-catching for the viewer to pay attention to. In particular, red, blue and especially yellow hold a significant importance to the story, with yellow not only being the colour of Jonas's iconic raincoat, but also the colour of the toxic waste barrels that will inevitably cause the apocalypse. And so, the audience is subtly informed to look out for when these primary colours appear, as it will lead to something of major importance. Season 2 is also where the nostalgia begins to take shape in the show, with the mirroring of other shots being used to remind the audience of moments and feelings from Season 1, with the prime example being Episode 6, which acts as a calm before the storm, where we get to slow down and have some character interaction and remind us of the calmer opening of Season 1, when these characters were living in their own time. The editing isn't something I've touched upon yet. If you've watched the clips I'm showing you, you'll see how Dark connects its thread across time with perfectly mirrored shots placed right next to each other, and you may even think it's a bit of a cheap way of doing it. However, I'd like to compare back to Joker, which has a reveal that a certain character wasn't really there. It goes all Fight Club on us, but proceeds to show multiple examples of her not being there, which is fine for maybe a few shots, but we get quite a flippin' lot of these, and it becomes more goofy than impactful, and that is entirely on behalf of the editing. Dark improves on this by firstly playing both shots at once to save on time, but also showing you every piece of the puzzle you may have missed, and not just the one character. You can see everything from the episode's beginning to end. Because this being a drama, and also not in English, there is a lot of dialogue, and a lot of dialogue you might have missed, so visuals are essential in catching the viewer up to speed before we move on. Whereas, Joker didn't really need this inclusion. It's just something you noticed in the first scene and forgot about because you knew it was going to happen. Let's move on to Season 3, where we can see this editing style change with the alt world in which the camera shots are flipped, and crazy alternate timeline versions of the characters allow the cinematography to show how far they've came since Season 1, by improving on their Season 1 shots. The alt world provided a huge challenge, going from 5 time periods to 10, but Samara cheated this a little by having all of the alt world feel much hazier to appear more in a bubble and isolated from our main timeline, so it is not always obvious which world you're in. Not to mention the different character designs that do a lot of the work for the shots. Season 3 goes even further back by showing adult Jonas and the 2019 crew in 1888, which once again required a new kind of lens to be used, instead of changing the camera, which retains the quality of the image, but adds the authenticity of the time by using a strong anamorphic lens for the 1800s, that wasn't made for the 65mm lens and therefore left large parts of both the top and bottom of the image to become guesswork, with early colour processing techniques inspiring the colour chrome look of this time period, which dulled down the skin tones to match the soft aesthetic of the era. The brief glimpse at World 3 that we see in the final episode is a brighter and more colourful image than any of the other time periods seen before, as the audience has now been taken out of the dark and into the light, a hopeful and melancholic return to reality. Dark stone blue and softly contrasted colour palette made it feel like a world trapped in the dark, with the Arri Alexa contributing towards being able to capture a perfectly crisp night shot without needing to film day for night. Everything is in the frame in its lifeless sincerity, the bursts of colour being used to further emphasise the dreary colour palette and further wind up the tension of an ever-growing set of questions. By coming out of the dark thematically concludes, the warmth bringing a sense that we should be happy. However, the emotions of the story, the loss needed to get to this moment, is what keeps the show right up until its last moments, with one foot in the dark.
Hey, ist alles okay?
Ich weiß auch nicht, ich glaube, ich hatte gerade ein Déjà-vu oder sowas.